The message has been very clear. People urgently want to end this war. We have millions and millions of Sudanese who are suffering. We're seeing horrible atrocities against women and children. We are already seeing signs of famine, and over 20 million people are actually facing catastrophic risk of famine and humanitarian no access. And there is continued violence. And so what we've heard from Egypt and Saudi Arabia, as well as my meetings with African counterparts in Kenya and Uganda, Ethiopia and Djibouti, is people want to see this war end. They want to see the Sudanese people have their future back, and they want to make sure people are getting the basic humanitarian access that can save lives. Well, we sincerely appreciate that Saudi Arabia has hosted earlier rounds of talks. We think it is urgently needed for those talks to restart as soon as possible, hopefully after Ramadan is done. We see this conflict escalating with great costs of human suffering. And we believe these talks should be inclusive of key partners on the African continent and in the region, and really anyone who is ready to be a force for peace and a force for handing the Sudanese people back their future should be part of talks to be able to bring a cessation of violence and to try to bring this famine and humanitarian crisis to an end. You know, I've been meeting with the Sudanese people, civilians who've been spread out across the region as refugees, and I've heard horrific stories. People describe having escaped hell on earth. People talk about imminent death. People talk about women who have had to go out to scrounge for food for their families and face rape and other atrocities and then have to return the next day. We're hearing about children who are trying to survive on half of a meal every day. And what we need is to see these things come to an end. We have seen abuses on both sides. We have seen crimes of ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity against the Masalit people by the RSF, as well as recent reports of forced recruitment of men and boys in this conflict. We continue to monitor these atrocities, as well as the fact that with the telecom down, we don't have all the data we need on things like the level of famine inside. So we do call on both sides to end these atrocities and meet the standards of international humanitarian law, which means food should be able to get across borders and cross lines and not be using the everyday people as a weapon of war. And we want to see the region speak with one voice in saying that these atrocities must end and any barriers to humanitarian access must be removed by both sides. Well, I think that there are positive international interventions in terms of those efforts to bring a peace deal to the table, including the talks that have been housed between our country and Saudi Arabia and Jeddah, and other recent efforts to bring together parties to try to reach a solution to this horrific war. But we've seen other countries taking a very destructive engagement in the country, whether that's fueling and arming sides, whether that's aiding in negative rhetoric. This is a time where the region needs voices of calm. We need to see this be concluded. The Sudanese people are facing the wet season, the rainy season very soon, and a situation inside that's already so difficult for our humanitarian workers, including the work that KS Relief is doing, is going to get that much harder, and we really need to see that resolution. So for those who are fueling this conflict, it's very important that they stop that now and become a voice for peace. And for those in the region that have been positively contributing to a peace process, it's time for us all to come together and find a resolution to this catastrophe. We are very supportive of the Sudanese people, and I think we need to distinguish what is a healthy political discussion between parties, like we have in my own country, from what is a consensus view of the Sudanese people. And when I talk to Sudanese from north, south, east, west, whether it's women, young youth, they want the same thing. They want the guns silenced and a peace deal. They want to see all humanitarian access. They do not want to see violent extremists and others take advantage of this moment to come into the country. They do want to see a unified professional Sudan armed forces, and they want to get back to the civilian transition that they risked so much a few years ago to have, and have that kind of a transitional government that allows the Sudanese to determine their own future. And I hear that from every Sudanese person, the groups that are organized, including those that are doing courageous work like the emergency response rooms to find ways to help those inside who are starving. That's the consensus we need to build from and allow the political process to play out over the coming years. I do, Tani. I think we see this great opportunity because, as you know, there are so many brilliant, talented Sudanese people who have expertise in finance or in development or in law. There's no shortage of amazing people who could come in not with political aspirations to run for office, but with a desire to play a unique role at this moment in helping the country transition to that period. A technocratic government is different than a power-sharing government where political parties are carving up the pie. We're talking about how we tap into that brilliance of Sudanese across many sectors of society and the economy being part of this civilian transition. You know, we saw that begin in 2019, and no country gets it right and perfect the first time. We've all had skips along the way, but I think there's a clear journey or arc that the Sudanese people want to be on, and I think this is a time to see so many leaders become statesmen in this case, put aside some of those personal aspirations to see this as a moment to do what's right for the country. That's what I hear from most Sudanese, and I think that is the right way forward for stability and for helping to ensure that this is not just a feud between either two fighting forces or several political parties. There's time for that down the road, but let's give Sudan their future back and let them figure out those questions over time. Well, currently we have a situation where the Sudan Armed Forces, which has a very proud tradition, it actually dates back longer than the country itself in terms of the modern state of Sudan, is in a position where it's both a fighting force and it is acting as a sovereign power. And that means we do hold it to a high standard in terms of the needs of international humanitarian law. And we do hope that we will see considerable progress. We've seen some small steps on border access. Where there are legitimate concerns, we can try to address those concerns. But right now, we need to be seeing massive convoys of humanitarian aid moving in, and we will hope that the Sudan Armed Forces is in a position to ensure that that can happen so that civilians are not vulnerable, and certainly see a path forward that I think includes a Sudan everyone can be very proud of. Well, first of all, Tahani, I really appreciate that you all are covering this conflict. Even though it's 50 million people, millions of whom have already been displaced from their homes, we haven't seen enough attention on this. We need the world, that's the Western world, the Arab world, the African world, to all be paying serious attention to this because we have some of the most vulnerable people on earth that are facing these horrific conditions. And we have a chance to make a difference and to intervene. And we are looking for both urgent and immediate steps on humanitarian access, but we also need to accelerate forward this peace process because every week we wait not only exacerbates this horrific human suffering, but also increases the chances that a two-sided war starts to factionalize into a more complicated war that pulls in more regional actors. And that's not something good for anybody, not just the Sudanese people, but all of the people across the region. So we see the urgent need to resume talks, not just to resume talks, but to complete talks. The goal here is to have a peace deal that provides that path forward for the Sudanese people. And I believe we can get that if we have the political will. And I believe we've seen that from these various initiatives that have popped up to try to be a place the talks could happen. We need to take the greatest hits album of which lessons we can learn from each of those processes, come together in formal talks in Jeddah, ideally, and move forward with those inclusive talks to a resolution that ends this conflict. I mean, inshallah, we would have a ceasefire tomorrow. I would come out of this interview and there would be a ceasefire. And we do believe that the two fighting forces have a particular role, responsibility, and ability to actually bring this to a close. But we also know that having the region speak with one voice about the urgency of that ceasefire is something that can help reinforce that, as well as getting those actors who've been pouring fuel on the fire to knock it off and stop doing so. So we come with that urgency here. But again, the talks, inclusive talks, are part of that solution. But really what we need is an agreement that allows the Sudanese people to have that future. We believe not only can it happen in the coming weeks, but it must.